Welcome to Logitique. I'm your host, Dr. Raymond Chang. Student protests. Yes, everybody's talking about the student protests all across the world these days. Now, dozens have been arrested in the campuses of the United States of America, and yet another week of pro-Palestine protests. And as of today, more than 2,000 people have been arrested nationwide as students continue protests calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Police have arrested at least 25 pro-Palestinian protesters and cleared an encampment at the University of Virginia, UVA, as campuses across the United States brace for more turmoil during graduation ceremonies. Some of the university's graduation ceremonies were even cancelled. Now, tensions flared at UVA's campus in Charlottesville, where protests had been largely peaceful until Saturday morning, when police officers in riot gear were seen in a video moving on an encampment on the campus lawn, cuffing some demonstrators with zip ties and using what appeared to be chemical spray. Now, in another video, police officers were seen to be beating up protesters with their batons. In fact, students across the United States have rallied or set up tents at dozens of universities to protest the months-long war in Gaza and calling President Joe Biden, who has openly supported Israel, to do more to stop the bloodshed in Gaza. They also demand their schools to divest from companies that support Israel's government, such as the arms suppliers. But you know, politics is what you see is not what you get. So what is it that is behind this? This week, we'll have a look. Now, of course, we've seen footage of protesters being cuffed, arrested, sprayed, and even beaten up. And according to the UVA, they said in a statement that protesters had violated several university policies, including setting up tents on Friday night and using amplified sound. Now, okay, right, so much for the freedom of speech. Now, UVA President Jim Ryan wrote in a message that officials had learned that individuals, and quotes, individuals unaffiliated with the university who presented some safety concerns had joined the protesters on the campus. Now, I guess he was trying not to use the word infiltrators, right? Now, we had a lot. Infiltrators back then when the riot hit hard on Hong Kong back in 2019, especially at the the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Now, come on, I can vouch for that as I also teach at that university. And I remember none of my students were there rioting inside the campus. But you know what? The police, the Hong Kong police back then didn't even marched in and used tear gas or spray or batons or whatever. They just waited until the protesters, not necessarily students, came out voluntarily. Now, of course, there are some who has to escape because they're neither students nor they have been protesting peacefully. And some of them even used patrol bombs, and there were even footage of police officers being shot in the lower limb with an arrow. Now, what level of violence are you dealing with in UVA, huh? You're talking about just tents and what amplified sound? Oh, that is deafening, right? Now, indeed, in a post on Instagram, a group called UVA Encampment for Gaza, which said earlier this week that had set up the encampment, condemned the university's decision to call in the police. Now, meanwhile, the Chicago Police Department said on X that dozens of people were also arrested for criminal trespass outside the Art Institute Chicago at a demonstration on Saturday, after the institute called in the police to remove the protesters. Well, it said they were illegally occupying its property. Now, while most of us were talking about the police, how the police had dealt with the protests, absolutely none of them seems to have looked at it from another angle. Now, in fact, there are two very specific angles that worth our attention. Now, one, that scene of student protesters flooding into a campus administration building, well, that scene actually played out 60 years ago at the University of California, UC Berkeley. The protests against Israel war in Gaza that have erupted on college campuses around the United States are merely the latest in a tradition of student-led, left-leaning activism dating back to at least to the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War protests of the late 1960s. Now, often the protests have played out on college campuses, and sometimes in the same building as previous years. Hamilton Hall at Columbia University, for instance, was taken over by students in the protests in 1968, as well as this past week, and at least 4 times in between. Now, sometimes the protests have seemed to be off-campus adaptations like Occupy Wall Street demonstrations of 2011 or the racial justice demonstrations of recent years. So if you say you have to deal with it within 24 hours, within 12 hours, and say, hey, you guys are occupying the university campus, that doesn't really make much sense. They've been here for multiple times, and now you can't put up with them? Now, like today's protests, most of the older movements were highly polarized. Now, some observers at the time praised protesters for the courage and idealism, while others criticized them for being misguided, self-indulgent, or guilty of flirting with or embracing irresponsible and even dangerous rhetoric and ideas. Now, a high propensity to offend can seem intricately intertwined with the fresh thinking that college-age students often bring to the world most difficult questions. And according to Rick Perlstein, a historian and author, now in an interview this week he said, "When you were talking about college students, you were talking about people who are barely out of childhood." And then he continued, "People who are barely out of childhood and basically on their own for the first time and exploring ideas for the first time, sometimes say crazy stuff, crazy things." So that means, in a way, that we should put up with them and see what they want. But not everybody's going to put up with them, at least not for Donald Trump. Now, former President Donald Trump has called the protests a disgrace to their country. And on Thursday, after protesters and the police clashed dramatically at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, and the other campuses, President Biden sought a middle ground. "There's the right to protest," he said, "but not the right to cause chaos." Now you see, Biden was trying to maintain his popularity, what we have called that popularity, for his upcoming elections, yet Trump was just speaking his mind. Now, but what is important here is not what they have said, but what they have done. Now, Trump simply spoke out his stance. Yet if you look at President Biden, he was trying to cancel student loans. And he did. He did. And on 21st of February just this year, President Biden canceled student debt for more than 150,000 student loan borrowers ahead of schedule, even after the Senate attempted to kill Biden's student debt relief plan back in November just last year, 2023. Now, the approval of $1.2 billion in student debt cancellation for almost eventually 153,000 borrowers currently enrolled in the Saving on a Valuable Education, which is called SAVE, repayment plan was eventually announced in Feb. Now, what does this tell you? It means the US government knew that students were pressured and they had to do something before the grievances mount up. Why? Because they could see what's coming when the Israeli military forces were not pulling out of Gaza. They knew there would be protests all across the United States and even internationally when they kept on supporting Netanyahu's government. They knew it. It's the election year. For Christ's sake, come on, they knew it. So why are they still allowing it to happen? And that brings us to my second angle. Now, for those of you who have read Shakespeare's 1598 Merchant of Venice, you will know that loan sharks were never welcomed. And who were the loan sharks back then? Jews. I'm not saying that I'm anti-Jews or supporting anything like anti-Semitism, but you have to understand it from the perspective of doing business, okay? This is not about race. It's not a racial thing here. It's purely business. So do you know how much and how long American students would have to pay for their student loans? Now, in a recent interview, students were complaining that after 10 years of repayment, they still have something like $70,000 to be paid. And the problem was that they actually left school like with an $80,000 debt. Like 10 years ago. So, and what that means is, unless your debt is forgiven, cancelled, or if you're dead, your debt would probably follow you for the rest of your life. Now, so in some ways, this is much like the pharmaceutical companies where they don't manufacture drugs or cures, but they find ways to make more people sick so they could sell more of the products. Now, I'm not even saying if they're right or wrong, but this is just how they do the business. And in the case of student loans, it's all about business too. The more students going to college, the more money you're going to lend, and so more people are going to repay you, if not for the rest of their lives. But if you can cancel or forgive student loans, then students could protest for more forgiveness. Now, you forgive them $10,000. This year, they want another $10,000. Now, if you are the loan service operator, you collect less as a result of less interests. If you are the taxpayer, you won't be happy with your taxpayer money going to fund the students. And in either case, this defies the basic business beliefs of the Jews. Now, these people are very much attached to their business beliefs. So the moment you sort of violated this, I'm pretty sure these were just cowboys, Republican cowboys from Texas. They could have just said, no problem, the bill is on me, let them study for free. But you don't normally see this coming out from the Jews, especially when they run huge loans or businesses related to finance. Now, the love and pursuit for interest is simply in their DNA. So if you step back and look at the whole story, so what has that to do with the protests? Universities, in this case, are business venues. That's the place where you accommodate your customers, and the whole thing is just like, some troublemakers being kicked out of a department store. The store owner just won't care if you have a point or not. They just won't care. All they want to do is to make sure that they can continue with the business at the department stores. So Yes, when student protesters say they wanted universities to divest funds from Israeli military and governmental operations in Gaza, what it means is actually to kick the owners out of the board. Now, that is simply out of the question. So that means they had to deal with it within 24 hours. You want to kick the owner out of the store? No way. And by the way, Israel is pillaging not just Gaza City, but also its waters. Now, foreign companies, including European ones, are actually helping Israel loot Gaza's natural gas reserves. In late October, the Israeli Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure announced that it had awarded concessions for natural gas exploration to Israeli and foreign companies in zones that significantly overlap with the maritime borders of Gaza. Now, needless to say, Israel as occupier has no right to award licenses in areas that it does not hold sovereignty over under any circumstances. Palestine is a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it has declared its maritime borders and boundaries in accordance with these principles. Mind you, Israel has not signed that Law of the Sea Convention, that UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And Israel does not recognize the state of Palestine and has recently doubled down on this position to oppose a unilateral recognition of the Palestinian state despite growing calls globally, including from the US, its main sponsor, for a two-state solution. Now remember, the US blocked that UN resolution to recognize Palestine as a UN member just back in early April. Now you know why. So the combination of all these positions has given Israel the excuse for not recognizing the maritime borders of Palestine and for expropriating the resources in these areas. Now these Israeli claims, of course, do not make its actions legal. So going back to the student protests, now that we have seen the story behind, you can now tell why some of these universities had to call in the cops within just a day, because what they were actually protecting wasn't about the university. It's about the business behind that they need to or forced to protect. So, until then, ciao.
Before you leave, please be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with your friends. See you in the next episode.